Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased. I welcome the report. I think it adds a lot to the debate. And what struck me was the wide range of events that actually are taking place across parks in London, from the smallest to the biggest. There are a few things that I wanted to sort of bring out of this, and one of which was that for many parks and local authorities running them, holding events is a crucial part of the business model for sustaining them financially. And this is, in a sense, come home to roost with COVID, that because a lot of events can't take place, then the income that would have come in is not coming in. But that the same could be said for other commercial activities that go on in parks, such as cafes and the like, that they are crippling the budgets and the business cases for the park service, and that's a huge worry. And it's not a matter that one needs to have this, got to have the events in order for the income. The growth of events in parks has been incremental as society has changed, and they've become more important to communities who live around them. And I'm a little nervous that the word commercialization could come across as being, it's a dirty thing. I think we've got to wake up to the fact that we're in a commercial world, and local authorities don't have the funding. They're not statutorily funded, the parks. And so it's actually very difficult to pay for their upkeep. And I think the other thing is that events don't just happen. They need to be organized, and that takes skills, it takes resources. And I know that a lot of events that are free because of income that's brought in by paying events. I think there is a tension here, particularly in London, where it's such a big city, so many people living here, and with we've got over 3,000 parks and open spaces, everyone different and all different sizes and shapes, and the communities around them. And I think there needs to be a distinction here between localized events and the larger events, which tend to take place in the larger spaces. And I would refer to them as kind of destination places. And because of the way they're organized, the events operators want to keep them in certain places because they build up a brand reputation, which is good for them, but also so people know where they want to go. So I think that kind of thing has happened organically. It's not been organized that way. And this draws me to, I think, one of the key issues here for London is that because London is fragmented in its management of parks and green spaces, you have the 33 boroughs, you also have the Greater London Authority doesn't own any spaces, but you have the Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, you have the Royal Parks as well, and the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which was purpose-built for events. And to try and coordinate the events and things across London would be incredibly difficult. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what the local council is willing to do. But you only have to go back a few decades to know that that wasn't always the case, and that the Greater London Council, and before it the London County Council, used to own and manage many of the larger parks in London. And they worked on the cultural offerings for these large events in a strategic way. And they even went to the extent of providing infrastructural services of water, electricity, sewerage and all that, for these events to come on a regular basis. Now, I think almost all of those have just no longer functioning, but it just shows how when there is an overarching strategic approach to these things, they can be better organized. And then I'm just going to quickly, there's much I could say, but the only other thing I wanted to say at this stage was that our charity Parks for London were very concerned that everything was being done in such an ad hoc way that early on in Andrew's work, back in 2017, I think, when we first met, 2016 actually, we were in the process of developing a generic policy, events policy, for boroughs that they could incorporate into their procedures. And I'm pleased to say that, I'm just checking my figures here, that so far over a third of London boroughs actually now have outdoor events policies, which are quite robust. They encourage transparency. And I suspect when we do the audit this year, later this year, we'll find that even more boroughs are actually following that approach. Very quickly onto the recommendations, just some that I want to pull out. One was about the policy recommendation. Yes, we think it's great. And yes, 100% we support the approach of ring fencing funding, but at the end of the day, it's a local issue and is decided locally. And I'm all for redesigning parks, and I alluded to this point about the need for, and Andrew said too, about the need for basic infrastructure to avoid all this horrible generators and things like that. And I think the idea of having a fallow year is a good one as well. So as to the coordination to minimize the impact, I think that's a good one. I think it'll be hard one to pull off, but I don't say that therefore we shouldn't try. But no, I really welcome this report and this discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, great. Yeah, there are already some interesting comments coming in the chat, and please do keep doing it. So just some of them were that saying that this all should be a statutory service actually, or also there's a concern as parks being described as business models, but we can come back to that later. But I would now like to introduce just briefly Nicola Dempsey from the University of Sheffield.
Hopefully there'll be a bit of a rethink on the priorities for some park users. It's certainly raising questions I see about how often we have to mow the grass, which is quite a basic question, but one that, that is very interesting at the minute. So in terms of the findings, and then I'm going to kind of intersperse my comments around the recommendations really. I thought it was interesting to see that around a quarter of the Friends groups reported no ticketed events in their parks last year. It's quite interesting because it's not just about the paid events in parks, but that is where most of the contention lies. Certainly when we talk about paid events in Sheffield, and we don't have really the kind of the extent of events that London sees going on in parks. But unsurprisingly, it's those free events which celebrate what the park's doing and what the park's about, which brings about those very positive impacts. So for me, that third recommendation of yours around local community groups being encouraged to organise free to access events by introducing more user-friendly procedures, I think that's quite an interesting one that chimes with what goes on up here. I completely agree that it is about building up the capacity of Friends groups and other groups to be able to organise their own events. And that could be about navigating the rules, the regulations, filling out the paperwork, you know, not insignificant things to overcome really. The Borough Council has got an important part to play in making that happen and making life easier. They're the ones setting the rules after all. It was only the other day I was having a chat with parks professionals about a group who just simply didn't fill out the paperwork and their event went ahead, everything was fine. We're sort of dealing with those sorts of issues at the moment with illegal events happening, and it'd be interesting to hear from people in the room how that's being dealt with in and around London. One finding I thought was concerning but perhaps not surprising is that a small number of larger municipal parks as Tony mentioned, reported very few free-to-access events. And what those priorities are for those spaces, I'm presuming they are about bringing in revenue, the destination park, but it does make me wonder who's setting those priorities, and are those priorities shared by the local residents, the local friends groups? And I think I was really struck by the quote back from one group saying that they didn't think that when I think it was fun fair users came in, that they weren't necessarily benefiting from that park experience. So again, something that Andrew's brought up already. It made me think again about what our parks are for. You know, I think they're great settings for events, and it's lovely being outside when the sunshine and warmth allows. But when the setting isn't important to the event, I think there are questions then that could be asked about whether the pros of holding an event in a park outweigh the cons. And this is where recommendation, your 7th one, about considering alternative outdoor venues when the park setting is irrelevant to the aims of an event, is interesting. It might be difficult to implement in practice, particularly when holding events in parks does bring in that much needed revenue that we've already talked about. And the thought of losing that revenue might be unpalatable completely for the municipal authority and indeed the group, the friends groups, the local user groups who want to welcome more people into their park. I was intrigued to find out more about the friends groups who could demonstrate that a local authority didn't make any money out of mega commercial events. That would be interesting to find out more about, and how the costs and benefits were worked out. And then, yeah, I think like Tony, I could talk about a lot that this report raises. I think the 5th recommendation, which was about surplus revenues earned from hiring out spaces, should be spent on parks. So this idea of ring fencing, particularly then being able to fund free-to-access events. Again, I think a really good idea in theory. It does raise questions. So would the revenue directly go back into the park that the event's being held in? Could it be that it goes towards free-to-access events in other parks, in the borough, or even neighbouring boroughs? Is there an appetite for friends groups to work together on events and to share the benefits from their event more widely in a community? And also this idea, I suppose that fallow idea, if you're sort of sharing the same event across a number of parks, perhaps because the scale is big enough, is it you have the event one year, we hold it the next year, and then you're spreading those benefits out. Again, I know it's about revenue, and I know it's about where that goes into whose coffers, but thinking about how those benefits might be shared could be something to think about in terms of, again, where those revenues go. Do they go into a wider council budget? Can they be ring fenced? Again, those are the sorts of things we talk about in Sheffield, and there's a different approach in different settings. I'm really interested in what comes next, actually, after the project. Well, after this part of the project. So, I mean, as well as users and non-users, 2 big groups who aren't involved in this survey are local authorities and the large events organisers. So it'd be really good to see how they go down, and I'm sure we've got some people in the room as well. For me, and I'll end here, it kind of raises some interesting questions about what local authorities could be asking of events organisers. So that ugly fencing, for example, no, you could put something up that's a bit more attractive. Can you fix some of the damage that's been done more quickly? And taking the involvement of user groups more seriously in events planning and management decisions, I think for me is a really important part of this report. It connects all the other recommendations. And yeah, as I say, if possible, can these conversations be going on beyond individual friends groups or individual sites to think about borough-wide benefits and even crossing borough boundaries as well? So yeah, that may well raise issues about where the money goes, how it gets accounted, but getting friends groups across boroughs and potentially across borough boundaries, I think would help more understanding of how everybody in a borough can benefit from events in parks. I know that won't be easy. I certainly can speak from experience in Sheffield, but yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for a really interesting report, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. That was great. Some really interesting and useful points and feedback. And just maybe then let's hear what Meredith would like to share with us, and then we can start the discussion.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much to Andrew and Goran for inviting me. I have the enviable position of going after Tony and Nicola, so I really could just say what they said. I think they covered it very well. I do have a few comments which I'll add. Some you may have heard a bit already. I think one of the things that struck me the most about the report was just the incredible range of events that take place in our parks and green spaces. And I was very pleasantly surprised that most of these events were received very positively, because I think I expected the report to have more of an anti-event or a negative approach. So I was pleasantly surprised that there is support for events. I don't think that necessarily comes through when you see reports in the media, which focus on the disruption and the noise and the litter. One of the things that really came out to me, I think it kind of permeates almost all green space, parks and green space research, is the question of what are parks for? Are they places for quiet reflection? Are they places for community events? Are they places to provide environmental or ecosystem services? Are they places to attract tourists and visitors? And I think the answer really is all of the above. And that's where a lot of the tension and the conflict comes from. A lot of Londoners don't have their own gardens, myself included. And I think that's become we've become more heightened to that fact during the pandemic and the lockdown. So what we do have is very valued. And even though that's a positive thing, it does put additional pressure on our green spaces. What we ask of our green spaces what we ask them to do is an incredible amount of work, not just for us as people, but really for London as a city and for the planet. So I think the comments from the Friends groups in the report and from the recommendations from Andrew and Goran about acknowledging that our parks and green spaces can really be at the forefront of making London a more inclusive city is a key role for these spaces. One of the things I focus on in my research is about a strategic approach to green space, because despite all the focus on public health and the pandemic, we still have climate change and other issues like obesity and loss of biodiversity. And so I think it's important to recognize that our parks and green spaces are part of a network. And even though you have a local community and a local friends group associated with a park, they're actually just one piece of a bigger puzzle across London. And managing more strategically or thinking more strategically fits in not just with providing environmental services, but also for things like events. And that kind of I think speaks to what Nicola was just saying about being more strategic and how events are planned and put on. I'm curious a bit more about the revenue that's raised, what happens to that revenue, and how that might differ across London's 33 boroughs. One of the other things I'll just add was, again, it's been mentioned that providing parks and green spaces is not a statutory requirement. It's discretionary, and I've been very assertive about saying it should be statutory, but I think there's a danger of thinking that's a magic bullet. Just because you make something statutory doesn't all of a sudden create a magic pot of money. So, with austerity, we've seen all kinds of services cut, obviously discretionary services cut disproportionately, but councils are already having trouble meeting demand just for adult and children's social care. So adding on more statutory services doesn't necessarily bring more money. So the idea of how to fund parks and green spaces is going to be something that's with us, even if we do find that they're statutory spaces. The other thing relates to governance, which again, everyone has brought up before. The relationship that friends groups have with the councils obviously varies across London. I know in my research, I talked with one council where there are 3 different friends groups around one particular space because the local residents don't agree on what should happen in that space. So it's a really complex and complicated relationship, and I don't think there's one size fits all. And so it's important to have that flexibility. And then finally, I originally, in case you can't tell from the accent, I'm not originally from Britain. I've been here more than a decade, but I'm originally from Austin, Texas, which is a city that very much prides itself on its live music. It's very central to the city's identity and to the economy. And we have a very large music festival that takes place in our flagship park downtown every year. It's called Austin City Limits Festival. And when that festival comes to town, it takes that park out of commission for 25 days, in addition to the 2 weekends when the festival takes place. But it also pumps $300 million into the local economy. And that's something that's been a constant kind of source of conflict in the city. So I think what the report and the research that Andrew and Goran are doing is, while it's particular to London and the UK, it actually is really relevant beyond Britain's boundaries.